Greetings. Welcome to the first virtual symposium sponsored by the International Association for the Study of Traditional Environments and supported by our colleagues at Nottingham Trent University. My name is Mark Gillen, and as the Iaste president, I want to extend to you a greetings and a warm welcome. I know that with our busy academic schedules, family obligations, and professional commitments, taking time out is always a challenge, especially in this COVID-19 era, so we hope to make this symposium well worth your time. As you may know, Iaste was founded by Professors Nazar El-Sayed and Jean-Paul Boudier at the University of California, Berkeley in 1988. Since its inception, Iaste has concerned itself with the comparative and cross-cultural understanding of traditional dwellings and settlements as an expression of informal cultural conventions. Iaste's core mission since 1988 has been to provide scholars from a variety of disciplines with global opportunities to exchange their ideas and share their research. We have three primary goals that support this mission. First, we host academic conferences every 2 years where scholars can exchange their ideas. Our next conference will be at Nottingham Trent University in early April 2021. Second, we publish a peer-reviewed scholarly journal, Traditional Dwellings and Settlements Review, and we also publish the Iaste Working Paper Series. Finally, we sponsor a visiting scholar program through which scholars from all over the world can join one of our affiliated universities to spend a semester or year doing research. Today, we're holding this symposium virtually in this COVID-19 era to start a dialogue on the ways in which pandemics like this one may impact and be impacted by traditional environments. Our panelists bring a deep knowledge of ancient history, digital media, contemporary design, and cultural heritage, and their voices will help us develop a deeper understanding of what this pandemic means to the future of our cities. They will respond to the following questions and more from their disciplinary and scholarly experiences. What modes of disruptive traditions that are occurring during the pandemic might shape new urban patterns, and how should we embrace this change? How will traffic flow shift? Will the flow of people towards urban centers for work and living and entertainment be reversed towards more rural, isolated, and protected communities? How will the practices of architecture and design adjust to the new norms of urban tradition? And will that influence our perception of density and decisions on where to live? How will we engage heritage, history, and culture in a more mobile, spatially disconnected, and more virtual environment? And how much will virtual environments contribute to more intelligent cities or less intelligent cities, greener cities or less greener cities? Certainly as the way we think about our workspaces, education places, culture, and tourism, there will be impacts. Well, now for a few logistics. We will be accepting questions through the event in the QA panel, so please use that if you want. In the first half of the session, we will have 4 distinguished speakers share their thoughts to the theme and some of the above questions. We will then have a 15-minute break and return for comments by 3 distinguished discussants, and that will be followed by a roundtable discussion. I want to thank our organizing committee, Dr. Hisham Issa, the Iaste Secretary, Monteiro Horangura, the Iaste Vice President, Dr. Mohammed Gamal Abdelmonem, Lindsay Deaton, Diane Wren, and Pamini Chowait for all the work they put into helping this symposium move forward. Now please join me in welcoming Professor Mohammed Gamal Abdelmonem, who is the Chair in Architecture and the Director of the Center for Architecture, Urbanism, and Global Heritage at Nottingham Trent University. He's a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, and he is the University Lead of the Strategic Research Theme, Global Heritage. Gamal is the recipient of the Nottingham Trent University 2020 Vice Chancellor Outstanding Researcher Award, and he's the recipient of the 2014 Jeffrey Cook Award from the International Association for the Study of Traditional Environments. Gamal, take it away. Thanks.
I wanted to extend my thanks to our distinguished speakers for accepting and spending the time with us, and for all the organizing committee for putting this event together. First, without further ado, we'll start our first session with introduction of our 4 panelists, and we'll start with Professor Neil Asher Silberman. Neil Silberman is an author and heritage professional with a specialist interest in the impact of heritage on contemporary society. He served for a decade between 2003 and 2013 as the founding president of the ICOMOS International Scientific Committee, on interpretation and presentation. And he was the editor of the 2008 ICOMOS Charter for Interpretation and Presentation of Cultural Heritage Sites. From 2004 to 2007, he served as a director of the INAMI Center for Public Archaeology and Heritage Presentation in Belgium. In 2008, he joined the faculty of the Department of Anthropology of the University of Massachusetts Amherst and became a founder of its Center for Heritage and Society. Professor Silberman has books that include the Oxford Handbook for Public Heritage Method and Theory, the Oxford Companion to Archaeology, The Future of Heritage, Who Owns the Past, Memory and Identity, and Heritage New Technologies and Local Development. Professor Silberman's bio is quite extensive, but I will stop here so not to take much of his time, and the mic now and presentation over to Professor Silberman. Professor Silberman.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure, and I wanted to begin by thanking Iaste and everyone concerned for this experience of COVID conferencing and symposia. Basically, I will share my screen now to start my talk, my brief talk, and let me just get it here. I hope it, there we are. Let me expand it. Okay. Great. Everyone see my screen, I hope. Okay. So I just want to begin by saying that really the name of this virtual symposium says it all, Disruptive Traditions, because this is, as we all know, a time of massive global disruption and part of the reason we're all here in this format. But in this short talk, maybe we should also be thinking of the disrupting of traditions as well. So disruptions to modern traditions are everywhere. And by traditions, I mean those kinds of behaviors that basically constitute the everyday. Between the various kinds are, of course, quarantines and lockdowns, masks and social distancing, economic contraction, remote education, and life and work spent at home, as everyone knows. But there are also, let me just get ahead, there are also disruptions to the way that cultural and urban heritage has been presented and consumed over the last few years. Little regional and certainly little international travel, no museums, no lectures or conferences, no tourism, no tours. And something that is quite clear as a phenomenon connected with that is that there is currently no development funds for historical and heritage sites. I would suggest that all the ways that we've come to celebrate and commemorate tradition and traditional environments have been disrupted. But the point I want to make in this short talk is that perhaps the most important and overlooked disruption is, I would suggest, actually caused by the modern concept of tradition itself. Our colleague Nezer Al-Sayad has written eloquently about the end of tradition, but I'd like to go even further. I'd like to ask if the concept of tradition and traditional environments, if it isn't more of an idealization than a reality. And is that idealization disrupting our ability to move ahead in these chaotic and uncertain times? If we look to the history of cultural heritage and its fascination for tradition, maybe we can blame it on the European Romantic movement's fascination for the ancient, the wild, and the primitive. But by the 21st century, I want to stress this, it has evolved from things and landscapes to a series of very concrete behaviors. To brand and consume something as traditional is to express a modern nostalgia for an idyllic and idealized pre-modernity. To impose a tradition as orthodox is to defend vested political power and religious power and search out and eradicate resistance or heresy. And finally, to live with or cast off the burden of tradition is to constantly search for acceptable boundaries of behavior or seek to break out to establish new identities. And I would mention here, this is taken from a really amazing New York Times photo essay on the rapid cultural changes in Mongolia in the first decade of the 21st century. And in the case of this family, we see a real transformation of what is considered an acceptable identity. But for the purposes of cultural and urban heritage, I can honestly say that the appeal of heritage has really become primarily in the before the COVID pandemic, basically a leisure time venue and a revenue generating resource for communities all over the world. The emphasis on the revenue generation has had a counter effect, however, in that the more traditional the performances, the attractions are, the more that people who live in those communities feel that they're putting on a show. Of course, it's not only tourism and cultural heritage. We all don't have to be reminded that heritage of various kinds has also been used to spread nationalism, xenophobia, and has encouraged patriotic monuments and ceremonies all over the world. In addition to that, there's another behavior connected with modern concepts of tradition, and that is gentrification. Historic preservation in urban centers has often raised property values through the meticulous physical preservation of traditional structures, traditional environments, but often at the cost of massive demographic change, and most important of all, perhaps, the dispossession of long-time residents of those historic centers, whatever their physical state. And finally, another behavior that is sort of paradoxical is that resistance and political recognition of marginalized communities has lured them into expressing their traditions in a parallel heritage identity politics, really no different in conception and I would suggest physical form to the officially recognized tradition and institutionalized cultural heritage institutions. The result, I would suggest, has been a strange hybrid of preserved traditions that is neither resilient, resistance, or truly preservative. Indeed, tradition has come to increasingly incorporate intangible cultural heritage along with built environments, as in this example of a intangible tradition, intangible heritage element on the UNESCO World Heritage Representative, UNESCO Intangible Heritage Representative list of a carnival from Slovenia. And so the UNESCO ICH list is filled with what I consider maybe not trivialities, but certain lesser elements of culture to evoke the pre-modern, but also that evades the most serious and long-lasting elements of what is truly global and tangible heritage, of power, inequality, cruelty, hatred. And yes, there is, of course, much exotic cuisine and colorful folk customs included on the UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage List, but not the traditions that have shaped the world in which we live. So I think that it's time to reconsider how we imagine the past and the usefulness that the imagining of tradition brings. We're at the leading edge of a new age, the Anthropocene, or perhaps the Covidocene, where the past is not just a source of commemoration or leisure time entertainment, but has also come back in the consciousness of so many people and communities around the world to collect the debts that we have historically incurred. The modern idea of tradition, I would suggest, is an externally imposed and no longer really useful ideological trope that defines its representation, and this is really the important point, as purer, more admirable, and almost always good. The very idea of tradition as something homogeneous and unchanging, whether in Europe, America, Africa, or Asia, is, I would argue, the most disruptive tradition of all. It holds us back from exercising agency and sharing the benefits of resilience in a world that will never go back to an imaginary primeval Eden of nostalgic social stability. Indeed, I would go further and suggest that the meticulously gentrified historic districts, rigid national icons, UNESCO's concept of outstanding universal, and even the heritage industry itself are all components of what I would call a obsolete, empty cult of relics that has no more usefulness in realistically touching the past, that is touching something material that has almost a supernatural connection with some unchanging heavenly reign. It's really no more useful in moving ahead than the sanctified medieval fragments of the true cross or the crown of thorns. And as we also know, in considering cultural heritage and its impacts on society today, the bottom-up, community-centered heritage protest actions that we're seeing taking place all over the world today, there's a new movement against the very concepts of authenticity and tradition imposed from on high. And I would just conclude by saying that the central question I'd like to pose is, in our uncertain COVID era, exactly what will the new conceptions of tradition be? Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Neil. Just really very thoughtful and very insightful look and view of the tradition, concept tradition, and its changing nature, especially at times of crisis like what we have been seeing over the past few months. We will hold all the questions and answers later on in the roundtable panel. So I wish to thank Professor Silberman for his insightful talk, and then we'll catch up with the points of his talk and questions and commentary and in the second session. Now, may I ask, I will move to the next speaker, Professor Sarah Kinderdien. And Professor Sarah Kinderdien research is at the forefront of interactive and immersive experiences for galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. In widely exhibited installation works, she has amalgamated cultural heritage with new media art practice, especially in the realms of interactive cinema, augmented reality, and embodied narrative. She is considered a pioneer in the field of digital heritage, digital museology, digital humanities, and data visualization, and has directed a series of laboratories in Australia, Hong Kong, and Switzerland. A former maritime archaeologist, Sarah has authored numerous scholarly articles and 6 books. She has produced 80 exhibitions and installations for museums worldwide, including Museum Complex in India, receiving a number of major international awards for this work. In 2017, Sarah was appointed Professor of Digital Museology at the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne, where she has built a laboratory for experimental museology, EM+, exploring the convergence of aesthetic practice, visual analytics, and cultural big data. She is also director and lead curator for EPFL, New Art and Science Initiative Art Lab, located in the seminal Kengo Kumar building, which was inaugurated in 2016. Professor Kinderdien's talk will be on disruptions in art and cultural practice. Please, Professor Sarah, take over the screen and with your presentation, and welcome to the event.
Thank you very much. I hope everybody can hear me clearly.
Yes, we do.
Turn off my video to share my screen just to preserve the bandwidth. Here we go. I'm assuming that this is all okay.
It's a blank screen, Sarah.
That's fine. How about that?
Yes. Yes. It's perfect now.
Okay, great. This short comment does not dwell so much on the disorder caused by the pandemic, but indeed the disruptions made possible by it. As an enabler of creative action, COVID-19 is an amplifier for revolutions in accessibility, distributed authority, and creative technology. Many cultural initiatives devised responses to COVID-19, and the discussions were anchored in this overarching concept of resilience that Neil mentioned. Museums, for example, play this fundamental role of resilience in societies, they say. The questions raised by bureaucratic organizations have included: what did COVID-19 reveal about the state of arts and cultural practice? Why indeed should we care about culture during a health crisis? And what can the creative sector learn from this crisis to be more resilient next time? By March 2020, most cultural institutions across the world were indefinitely closed and in-person exhibition events and performances cancelled. It is impossible to generalize at a global level the impacts across specific artistic communities because governments have had very different responses to dealing with this fallout. It should be noted that the number of museums worldwide have increased by almost 60% since 2012 to some 95,000 institutions. On the occasion of the International Museums Day in May this year, UNESCO and ICOM confirmed that 90% of them have closed their doors during the crisis. It is estimated that 13% of the museums around the world may never reopen. I'll briefly focus on impacts, then reverberations, and then conclude with certain futures for COVID-19 art and cultural practices. This simple statistic from Australia demonstrates how rapidly art and cultural organizations were affected. It shows the percentages of those still in operation in the arts and recreation that had the sharpest decline. The general trend has only changed today, being superseded by the food and travel industry. On the flip side of the decimation of cultural activities, we know that technologies companies have been able to reap substantive profits, and many of these companies are directly related to new forms of entertainment, computer games, and streaming live videos. How is art and culture participating in this seismic shift online? As the UNESCO director reminds us, it's only half of humanity that has access to digital technologies. The online world has displayed intensive efforts to provide alternative and additional services through these digital platforms and to maintain essential services and activities with minimal resources. They also document the events through new acquisitions, including new creative works inspired by the pandemic, such as the work of Leroy New called New Social Distancing. In the Philippines, Leroy and his team were significantly involved in creating masks for health workers during this period, and because the government had failed to adequately protect them. But in his artistic response, using waste materials, he visualizes the physical expression of COVID as a virus and its impacts on the social being. Art reminds us we are not obligated to recognize what is simply because it is given. Rather, it helps us cultivate the imagination to make something new of the old. These are the words of Angela Davis, the political activist and academic. The performing arts were heavily struck, but spawned inventive modes of theatre. US Arts Council report From Live to Digital in 2018 had already pointed out the potential of streamed performances to increase access to theatres. Streaming does appear to attract younger, less wealthy, and more ethnically diverse members of the population, it said. Creation Theatre's rendition of The Tempest, in which distributed actors embodied their characters while the audiences simultaneously inhabited the virtual space. One audience member says, I switched to gallery mode during the banquet scene to see this wonderful array of different consumables being held up by audiences and creating a brilliant, farcical interaction. So, the idea of remote telepresence exemplified by video conferencing has, of course, long been explored by artists, such as the seminal and prescient work of Paul Simon, Telematic Dreaming from 1992, a live video installation linking two remote sites over a telephone line. The video image of each performer or each user in these remote locations were beamed over the telephone line to be projected onto the bed next to the other performer. The complex semiology of the bed heightens the experience of telepresence in an ecstasy of communication, as Jean Baudrillard has described it. The prescient work of Jeffrey Shaw, who commissioned a photograph of downtown Hong Kong during the height of the protests recently, in which all the people were digitally removed. In this panorama, he restaged an older artwork from the very early days of computer graphics, when only primitive forms could be rendered. In an exhibition that launched just 1 month before COVID hit Wuhan, he subsequently asks us, is this the future? The subsequent mass professional and amateur photographers were busy capturing life without us, but this was soon replaced by the Black Lives Matters movement, as one of the most defining features of the health pandemic was to expose that of long-seated inequalities across society. The tragedy in America heaved consciousness across the world with corresponding reverberations in art and culture. This haka outside the US Embassy in New Zealand, all the way down under, is a cultural practice widely performed beyond the All Blacks on tour. It is a potent symbol for communities who come together in strength for strength. Cultural practices as forms of modern protest. Confederation monuments, of course, as Neil has shown, tumbled into the rivers and oceans. But if we look at the statistics of this moment, we see, in fact, throughout recent history, and the Black Lives Matter movement, especially in the States, has had numerous encounters with this idea. The British Museum removed a bust of its founding father, Hans Sloane, from exhibition because his wife's Jamaican sugarcane plantation. In the course of the Black Lives Matter movement, it was discussed that he had slaves working for him. Confronting its links to colonialism, Hartwig Fischer, the director of the BM, revealed the statue of Hans Sloane has been placed in a secure cabinet alongside artifacts, explaining his work in the context of the British Empire. Fischer says, "We have pushed him off his pedestal. We must not hide anything. Healing is knowledge." With coronavirus and social distancing, blockbuster shows of originals requiring large numbers of visitors to justify costs are no longer viable. The COVID shock, coupled with distance measures, has meant that galleries, even if they are open, are virtually empty now. The Riga Festival uses its mostly empty exhibition space now as a stage set for a new film which is being shot, and those visitors that happen to come by are included in this film. The seminal media arts festival, Ars Electronica, becomes a global journey mapping the new world, a journey in which it is not us who set out to travel, but our ideas and our projects, which span a global network in which we gather to discuss what needs to be done. Autonomy, democracy, ecology, technology, humanity, uncertainty. Apart from the distribution and proliferation of events, we see how digital formats are cleaving new cultural practices and forms of participation. The public demand for in-person cultural activities is expected to return, but the assumption is different kinds of experiences will be demanded. Many would argue that the emphasis on the digital and of the digital on the arts and cultural sector has never been more important. Distributable objects carry huge erratic effects, and these need to be acknowledged, emphasized, and expanded. Myself, I'm interested in computational museology, but not one based on a database logic, but one in which computation can become experiential, spatial, and materialized, embedded, and embodied through various participatory and interactive regimes, both online and offline. And I'm just going to offer one example from my own research, which hints at some of the issues at stake for museums and producers. This is Jazz Luminaries on the right-hand side. It was a work for an exhibition called Infinity Room 2 I curated at the EPFL, and it's based on the constellations of jazz greats from the Montreux Jazz Archive. This installation cuts, remixes, and replays 5,400 artists, 13,000 videos from a total archive of 11,000 hours of video, all part of the UNESCO Memory of the World Archive. So the neural net image that you see here is based on the social network of the artists, and the clustering is based on the number of times these artists played with other artists. B.B. King lies at the very center of this dense network. What remains fundamental is a seismic shift online, is that the large majority of moving image archives are so copyright encrusted that not a single thing can be shared on the internet. And so only in situ experiences of the archive can be realized. This work was staged in a full dome, and underneath the full dome, visitors are lying down on inflatable poofs, hopefully 1.5 meters away from each other. And the interface is a spherical ball emulating the hemispheric image plane. It plays with ideas of search by replacing text-based searching with auditory strategies of tuning the radio or channel surfing. When you hear what you like, in you go to the rest of the experience. Most people have no clue who the jazz greats are, so it's essential for us to find new modes of access to these mass archives. This interface is also shared amongst users. It's a highly social moment of exchange. It is, in fact, what cultural events are all about. So how do we harness this in the new age of the visitor? I'll just show a brief snippet of this video. Here you are, surfing the constellation. You hear what you like, you go into the next level, and it has 3 levels to it, but I won't go further right now. The reason to mention this work actually is to look more deeply into the future. Recent advances in biotech engineering and computer science now mean that we can transform digital data into synthetic DNA, which in turn can be retrieved to reconstruct the original. Tutu by Miles Davis and Smoke on the Water by Deep Purple from the Montreux Jazz Archive were encoded like this, and the results are now available to listen to. The entire
Sarah, 1 minute, please.
Yep, the entire archive, once encoded like this, will fit into a single grain of sand. It's suggested that the entire data of the world would be able to be stored in a single suitcase, a radical repositioning of objects in time and space. But let's just return to the problem of performing arts. So performing arts, people earn nothing by their online experiences, and now that their theaters are open, only 1 in 10 visitors can get a seat. So with the spontaneity of live works removed, surely audiences will just turn to the archive produced without such constraints. But none of this is of help to performers today. Indeed, competition from the archive may actually cause active harm to them. So to say all of these issues are heavily entwined, but it is this worldwide crisis that has brought these multitude of voices into dialogue with each other, and more visibly than ever before. Perhaps our cultural imaginary has never been so vibrant. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. And this is really fascinating presentation, of course, and it does share a lot of questions and a lot of issues with the global challenge, as we call it now, how museums and exhibition would reconnect as a public art.
Gamal, can you please start your video?
How can I do that? Just a second. Yes, that's okay.
Yes.
Sarah, all right. Thanks, Sarah. It's important issues and questions, and I wish to remind all our attendees that you can raise your questions as we speak, but this will be in the Q&A session box, which will be shared with the speakers at a later stage. So at any time, if you have a question, please go ahead and use the question box and then put your questions. Then we'll move to the third distinguished speaker today, Julia Barfield. And Julia Barfield is a founding director of Marks Barfield Architects, together with her husband and partner, David Marks, also the originators and creative entrepreneurs behind the design realization of the London Eye. Julia studied at the Architecture Association and spent a year out in South America working in Barriada of Lima, Peru. She has worked for Richard Rogers and Partners and Foster Associates. She was a project architect for the Sackler Galleries in the Royal Academy. Julia is currently on the National RAB Awards panel and the LLDC Quality Review panel and is an advisor for the Design and Built Environment Master's course at Cambridge University. She has lectured in schools, universities, and conferences in the UK and overseas, including Beijing, Mexico, Rome, Berlin, and University of Virginia. Jointly with David Marks, Julia has received the Prince Philip Designers Prize, a special commendation, and winner of Queen's Award for Enterprise Innovation in the year 2003. Marks Barfield Architects was shortlisted for the Sterling Prize in 2000, won the Building Architecture Practice of the Year Award in 2001, and BD Sports and Leisure Architects of the Year Award for 2009. Please join me to welcome Julia, and Julia, the mic and the platform is yours.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen. Can everybody see that? Oh, God.
No, Julia.
Oh, sorry. Can you see it now?
We can.
Yes, we
can see.
Sorry. Can you see it now?
Yes, we do.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. So I'm just going to first introduce the practice with a few images of our projects to put kind of flesh on the bones before moving on to the main subject of the disruption and its impact on architecture in our cities. I founded Marks Barfield 30 years ago, as Kamal said, and our portfolio is unusually diverse across many sectors, and it includes self-generated projects like the London Eye and the Brighton Eye 360, where we took the leap to become entrepreneurs as well as architects. And we've been told that our work is difficult to categorize, and we relish this because each project is unique, coming as it does from a thorough understanding of the client's needs, aspirations, site, context, and its history, as well as the broader social and imperative and environmental imperatives. So in a way, it would be strange to us if each project was not very different. Now, moving on to disruption. As has been said by other speakers, it certainly is a time of great uncertainty, change, unease, and polarization. And not just in COVID, we're seeing it in so many aspects of our lives, in technology and politics, and malign and benign forces seem to swirl around us in equal measure. And COVID has not been just a health tragedy. It's shown us that sometimes the impossible suddenly becomes possible with the astonishing state intervention of our government. It's been a time of reflection, a time to think about what really matters. Key workers are recognised for what they really are, essential, even though they're not paid accordingly. And the appetite for a more caring and sharing society has emerged and shone a light on our capacity to pull together for the common good in times of emergency. But it's also shone a light on the fragility of our food systems and the global manufacturing network, as well as our social inequalities, with a 400 increase in the use of food banks. COVID has been disruptive, but it's also been a great accelerator. It's obviously accelerated our digital connectiveness, as evidenced by our session today. And with thousands of us compelled to work from home, it's seen huge changes, and it's been certainly easier for some than for others. And we've all had to find new ways to look after our health and well-being at work. This is our office trying to keep up our spirits while playing a game in one of our socials. But we're also discussing important aspects of office design. We can't go back to business as it was before. Indeed, housing design needs to adapt if more people are going to work from home in the future, as I suspect they will, particularly the ones with long commutes. But also, the office is not dead. This is an office building we're building at the moment, and we've embedded ideas of well-being, bringing nature into the office, and I'm sure these ideas will also be accelerated now to make the office in a way more like home. And as the streets of our cities cleared of cars around the world, the air also cleared, and very dramatically, like in New Delhi. And it's been the same in many global cities, but it's also highlighted just how bad things had got and prompted many to think that there has to be a better way. And as disruptive as COVID has been, and its inevitable disastrous financial fallout will be, they pale into insignificance compared to the global impact of the impending climate and environmental emergency. This is the big disruptor of our traditions, I argue, because our response to it determines starkly whether we actually have a livable planet. And indeed, the pandemic gave us a glimpse of the level of change that is needed. The suspension of virtually all economic activity during the lockdown is likely to cut global CO2 emissions in 2020 by 5.5%. Yet in November last year, the UN reported that to meet the 1.5 Paris target, we need to make cuts of 7.6% every year. And we all know by now that the emergency is with us now, whether it's floods in Africa or floods in Yorkshire, and fires in Australia or fires in California. And I always think it's very poignant, particularly the slide on the left, which is Paradise Lost. I woke up to the urgency of the emergency when I read about the IPCC report in October 2018, and has since become obsessed, because when the world's top scientists warn us that we have 12 years and now 10 years to limit climate and environmental catastrophe, I think we have to listen and act professionally, personally, and politically. And for me personally, it also coincided with the birth of my first grandchild, an event that certainly focuses minds. This is by far the most important issue of our time. And given that the construction sector contributes disproportionately to the problem, with 40% of CO2 emissions in the UK, it's beholden on us to contribute to solving it. We are creative problem solvers after all. So how should architects and the construction industry respond? Well, I joined a number of architects, mainly practice leaders, and we launched Architects Declare in May last year. It's based around 11 pledges that each practice signs up to. And I can't go into all of them now, but it's about raising awareness, advocating faster change towards regenerative design practices, sharing knowledge and minimizing waste. And since May last year, it's spread beyond our wildest expectations, first to other disciplines, and also now it's gone global. There are more than 5,000 companies worldwide in 23 countries who have signed up, and we're still growing. There's almost 1,000 signatories in the UK alone. So how are we making a difference? Well, we're trying to shift mindsets. We had an event where the amazing Kate Raworth gave a talk talking about her donut economics that has imagined a whole new economic paradigm with humanity and social justice at its core that stays within planetary limits. We've been sharing knowledge. This is a workshop we organised about embodied carbon, which is the hot topic at the moment in architectural circles. We're also collaborating. We're also collaborating with many other groups, and also campaigning, trying to make building regulations more stiff. And also we've written a letter to Boris with very helpful ideas as to how the recovery could be greener. It's not enough just to build, build, build. We need to build in the right way. And we've been engaging with our signatories and nurturing them so that they become self-sustaining and self-motivated. And they've been urging us to go further, pushing further beyond and not going back to old ways. And I just put this in there because it's not all doom and gloom. If we respond to the climate crisis in the right way, it's going to make the quality of people's lives better. So what does this new type of architecture that's responding to the COVID crisis look like? Well, we need a completely different mindset, as I mentioned. We need to look at the whole life cycle of our buildings from cradle to grave and think about what they're made out of, and then what happens to the building at the end of their life. Are they deconstructed or what? And we need to ask tough questions. I mean, do we need to build at all, for example? But given the title of this seminar, I also thought about other disruptive traditions and wondered whether there are lessons to be learnt from traditional and vernacular architecture, something that we've been thinking about all through our practice. Because vernacular architecture sits lightly on the earth, uses local natural materials with efficiency and frugality, and uses materials that will last and can be easily maintained with no residual waste. It also results in forms and structures developed from those materials using local technology and craftsmanship that reflect the cultural traditions of the people of that time and place. I think we can learn from the past while also looking to the future, not in a nostalgic way, and certainly with nothing to do with style. And now I've put together a series of examples of how architects are responding to this. And this is a mosque that we've recently completed. This is one of our projects recently completed in Cambridge, where we've used an entirely timber structure, influenced also, as you might see, by the traditional English fan vaulting of King's College Chapel. This is another material that I think will become much more used in the future, hempcrete, which is in a way like the modern wattle and daub, but in block form. It's carbon negative, so it's in terms of zero carbon, it's incredibly light, it's incredibly efficient, it breathes, and it's non-toxic. Also, a traditional material is of thatch is being reimagined by many contemporary architects, even to be used as vertical walls. And we need to ask ourselves, do we demolish or do we retrofit? And what materials do we use or reuse? So this is a great example of upcycling, actually literally cutting out sections of brick wall and reusing them in Copenhagen. And this is a great example of the reuse of a whole building. So this was a Walter Siegel building that was disassembled from the London South Bank, literally taken apart and reconfigured for a children's charity in Stockwell, and then rebuilt. What could be more sustainable than that? And this is a fantastic example of an energy positive building built in Norway by Snøhetta architects. And they worked out that it generates more energy than what is used in its construction, operation and disposal. So it's an energy positive building. This is another example. It's Goldsmith Street in Norwich, a social housing project built to Passive House standards that won the Sterling Prize last year and eliminated fuel poverty for many of its users. And what about our cities? Cities are leading the way. They are the powerhouse of radical system change rather than government, sadly. Amsterdam has enlisted, for example, Kate Raworth, who I talked about earlier, to look at ways of making Amsterdam more circular, looking at synergies and reducing resource, energy use and waste. And COVID has definitely accelerated the move to more cycling and walking in our cities. And ultimately, I feel the demise of the private car. This is Manchester, that's got a fantastic system called B-Lines. And of course, reclaiming our streets has been happening already. But again, I think the COVID crisis has accelerated it. And I'd just like to finish with this report that was out only last week. That's called People, Parks and Parking. It calculated that if you remove the space for private cars in these cities, London would reclaim 3 times the space of Richmond Park, Paris 3 times the Bois de Vincennes, and New York 4 times Central Park. And I think it's interesting to see that car use in the center of these cities is actually very low. There's almost 60% in London living in the center that don't have a car. And that's higher in Paris and even higher in Manhattan. So it's in a way, it's already happening. Private car use is definitely on the way out. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Julia. It's really always...
Gamal, your video, please.
Yes, I'm trying. It's just preventing me from starting my video. Yeah. Sorry about this small technical hiccups from one point to another. Thanks a lot, Julia. It's always inspiring because architects are always being blamed for causing all havoc when it comes to climate change, and they are always late on responding to climate crises. But lots of interesting points, lots of discussion will follow in the roundtable panel, and really thank you very much for your talk. We'll move now to the fourth, but not least, last distinguished speaker, Professor Michael Scott. Michael Scott is a professor of classics and ancient history at the University of Warwick, UK. He has written a number of books about ancient Greek and Roman worlds, as well as about wider global connections in antiquity along the early Silk Roads. For his work, he was awarded honorary citizenship of Delphi, Greece. He is a National Teaching Fellow, a Principal Fellow of the Higher Education Academy, and has taught in the US, Brazil, Greece, Italy, China, and the UK. He is also deeply committed to communicating his subject to the wider world and has written public history books, radio shows, and written and presented over 15 TV documentaries for National Geographic, ITV, BBC One, BBC Two, BBC Four, and SBS. He is the author, among others, for Ancient Worlds, an Epic History of East and West in 2016, Space and Society in the Greek and Roman Worlds, 2012, Delphi and Olympia, the Spatial Politics of Hellenism, in 2010, and From Democrats to Kings, the brutal dawn of a new world, from the downfall of Athens to the rise of Alexander the Great, 2009. Professor Michael Scott, the mic and the screen is yours. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Gamal, and good afternoon to you all. I'm hoping that, has my video been stopped again?
Yes, we can see your picture.
Hopefully
we can
I'm
see
back
your
now.
screen. Yes, you are back now.
Brilliant. Thank you so much indeed. What I will do is share a PowerPoint with you now as well. Let me just start that. Hopefully that should give you a PowerPoint presentation that you can see now.
We can see your home screen.
Okay. Let me redo then, which I am sharing. There we go. That should offer you a PowerPoint now.
Yes.
You can see. Thank you so much indeed. And thank you to everyone for helps with all the technological difficulties and troubles. It's a great pleasure to be with you to talk a little bit about disruptions in history and archaeology. As Gamal said at the beginning, my field of specialist knowledge is ancient Mediterranean studies, that of particularly of Greece and Rome, but also merging into early Silk Road connectivity between the Mediterranean through Asia into China. And I wanted to start, if I may, with just two moments from the past that can perhaps offer us a message, not a hugely positive message, I have to add, but one I think that's important as we look forward, as we are attempting to do in this seminar. And these are of two early pandemics that occurred during the time of the height of the Roman Empire, but indeed also as a direct result of the gathering global connectivity that the world was experiencing. The first, you may well have heard of, the Antonine Plague in the 2nd century CE, very much caused as a result of the first connectivity occurring across Asia between China and the Mediterranean. It's in this period that we hear, for instance, of Roman envoys turning up in Han China. And this plague led to a cessation, we can see from the surviving evidence, of cross-community trade along those early Silk Road networks for a period of about 30 years. Through to the 190s, as is demonstrated particularly from the surviving evidence at places like Palmyra that were key cross-border trading posts, in this case between the Romans and Parthians. But I think perhaps the second example of the Justinian plague that came to haunt the Mediterranean and the Roman world in the 6th century CE is perhaps for us even more important. At the time, in 541 to 49, there was a series of what we might call mini waves of plague that kept hitting the Roman Empire over this 8-year period. But in fact, now scholars, with the benefit of hindsight, looking over a much wider period, see the connections, not just in the biology and pathology of the plague, but in terms of the effects that these infections were having on the communities, really seeing this 8-year period in 541 to 49 as just the beginning of a number of larger waves of related plague that actually kept washing across the Mediterranean through to the 8th century CE. And we've seen in previous presentations this afternoon about the waves that are coming to us, not just the plague-related ones, but I think very much what this ancient example just reminds us, as we begin now to think about how our first wave of COVID is going to disrupt us moving forward, that actually we need to keep thinking that there may well be a lot more disruption to come, and that this conversation is not one that can be had once, but one that will have to be going on and responding in real time as we move through what could be a series of waves of plague coming towards us. Now, I was asked to respond to 3 questions in particular, and you can see them there on your screen. So I'm going to look at each of these in turn with some thoughts, followed by my response to the more general question that was asked of all the panelists. So if we start with this first one, how will we engage with heritage, history and culture in more mobile, spatially disconnected and virtual environments? Well, I think here, if I think just for a moment about the field of archaeology and the study of ancient history, immediately we have seen a change. The 2020 field season for archaeology in terms of traditional trench excavation was impossible. You couldn't get the international teams to the locations, you couldn't have them in such small trenches without social distancing, and it was in many ways a write-off. But at the same time, the pandemic, and we've seen this come through in a number of the talks this afternoon, has sped up a series of technological changes that were already being witnessed in the field of archaeological excavation, particularly in terms of lone operator tech. And here I'm thinking about geographical information systems, LiDAR, satellite imagery, and the laser scanning of existing monuments. It's perhaps no coincidence, I think, that in summer 2020, Cambridge University was able to announce something that they'd completed in the previous archaeological season, the first Roman town in Italy to be plotted in its entirety using only geographical information systems, GIS, without a single trench excavation. And what they were able to offer was a complex, multi-layered map of the different levels of the settlement under the ground, one of the big, most recent advances in GIS, allowing us to understand the town's growth over a period of time. And what I think we will also see in terms of the way that the study of the ancient pasts through archaeology and history changes as a result of this lone tech is that we can then use the imagery and the data captured by GIS, LiDAR, satellite, laser scanning to enable more spatially disconnected and virtual environments from antiquity to be more readily available to particularly the heritage museum sector, but also directly to the general public. One of the things Gamal mentioned that I'm involved in is a number of TV programs here in the UK, particularly with the BBC. And one of the series that we did over 2014, 2017, 2018 was a series called Invisible Cities, where we went to a number of major settlements, Cairo, Istanbul, Athens, Rome, and we laser scanned a number of the ancient monuments, as well as, of course, being there ourselves in real time. What that then led to was a program, as you can see from a few of the pictures here, that allowed us to combine our real presence in these locations and then morphing smoothly into laser scanned models, which had been turned into virtual realities. And it wasn't just us within these programs that were able to experience these virtual realities, but we were then able to make them available as short guided YouTube virtual reality experiences for the public to watch at their leisure from their own homes after the broadcast of the programs. And these models, these virtual reality models, have also now found their way into a number of museum exhibitions. And as we've already seen in a number of the talks this afternoon, museums are already responding with more virtual museum visits and tours available online. And this, I think, is a very different direction from the simply loading up more images of their collections onto websites. And I think what we are going to see is the need for future exhibition planning to encompass an online element, almost in parity of importance to the real experience they're trying to provide in their galleries. And I think that will lead to a reignition of quite an old and crusty debate about what does one actually get from seeing an artwork in the flesh as opposed to online, particularly now once it is dressed within these new virtual reality environments. The second question that we looked at was, will more intelligent communities and living change the perception of history? Or may it facilitate more historical learning innovations? I think here there is quite a lot to say, and we can already again see this move happening. That the more and more we create and thus look at and think about visual experiences of the past via things like virtual reality and laser scanning, that can be fed into levels of history learning at all levels. And I'm particularly involved in my outreach work about getting these kinds of experiences of history into schools. I think history will move as a subject from being renowned as it's just one fact or event after another towards thinking about history as primarily the understanding of experiences of different periods and places. What did it feel like to live in? What was it like to walk the streets, etc.? And I think this in turn will prompt people to ask questions about the experience of a wider variety of groups from history. And this is a direction, thankfully, and very importantly, we're already traveling in. And I think it will also, kind of the experiences that we are living through today, particularly things like this pandemic, will encourage us to ask questions of the past about how different communities interacted and thus and experienced things in community with one another. This will challenge the way that history is in fact studied, broken up as it is into micro disciplines of particular geographical areas, which simply won't be able to answer those kinds of cross-community questions. So I think we're having to think much more about the world and the ancient world like this, where the Mediterranean is just one part of a series of communities that have up to now been studied in isolation from one another, but which from now, hopefully, will be studied as they existed as part of a connected whole. Finally, to think about how will the mission of higher education institutions change? I think they will and are already, and as I prepare to go back for a new year at the University of Warwick in the UK, we are talking about what our flexible learning style, our blended learning style will need to be. We are seeing in a couple of months what I think universities would perhaps only have achieved in perhaps 10 to 15 years in moving towards a blended online and virtual learning environment combined with some face-to-face learning. And I think that needs to be balanced with the sense of value for money that students who are, at least in the UK, paying an increasing amount of money for their university experience, what they see as value for money in terms of that blended learning experience. I think what we also hope is that, excuse me, universities will continue to push the digitalization of research resources. We've had this alluded also in one of our previous talks, because particularly within the arts and humanities, what we found during the pandemic is that research, for which we need to be in libraries and have access to collections which are not yet online, has simply come to a halt. If academics are to continue their job of research, those resources need to be made quickly available in their entirety. And I think universities are going to have to work very hard, particularly, and this has been an issue in the UK, particularly over the last decade, to push back against their ivory tower image, particularly now that it will be much more difficult for people to actually come onto university campuses. And we're thinking about this particularly from an outreach and widening participation perspective, as we want people to engage with and think of the university as a place for them, when it is actually now not an easy place for them to physically come to. And I think universities and higher education boards are going to have to think about how they can help us break those traditional disciplinary boundaries to think about subjects in more interdisciplinary ways if we are going to respond to the key research questions of the future. So very quickly, and finally, that general question, what modes of disruptive traditions that occurred during the pandemic might shape new urban patterns and embrace this change? In particular, in terms of archaeology, what I would love to see happening in terms of new urban patterns and construction is the fact that we can create pasts using virtual reality, but equally techniques like 3D printing means that actually our past can be more readily integrated into construction that we see around us. We can actually have history more seamlessly woven into the new urban landscape. In the heritage sector, I think we'll see museums and galleries really thinking about their virtual online experience, and I would hope that this will allow more micro and regional museums to spring up and exhibit online. And universities, well, I think those that can will expand their physical campuses to allow students and attract students who want a safe face-to-face online and campus environment, as well as some parts blended learning. Thank you very much indeed for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Michael. I'm trying to put back. I think you need to quit first, Michael, so I can share my video. Yes, thanks a lot, Michael. Of course, you led the way for the invisible cities and the use of LiDAR and virtual reality in historic cities. And this has become now a leading in the field. And really, maybe this is the way to go forward. So really appreciate your talk, and especially when your voice seems to be at pain to really communicate your talk. Thank you very much for your time. Now we have the first 4 speakers concluded their talk, and then back to you, Mark, to wrap up the first session. Thank you, everyone.
All right, thank you, Gamal, and thank you to our speakers. Very interesting discussions. We've looked at the impacts of this moment of disruption on urban heritage in Neil's discussion. Sarah talked to us about the impact of this moment of disruption on cultural practices, and then Julia discussed the impact on design and architecture, and Michael wrapped up with the impact on history and archaeology. Wonderful array of presentations and great images. I want to thank all of the presenters for taking time to put their presentations together. At this point, we'll be taking our break. We are right on schedule, so we will take a 15-minute break, and we will return at the bottom of the hour at past, and we'll be opening up with our panelists. We have 3 discussants, and Gamal will be introducing each discussant. Each discussant will have a few minutes to share their initial thoughts, and then following the discussant thoughts, we'll have a roundtable discussion that Gamal will host. So we are right on time. Thanks, everybody. We have over 200 people participating. We appreciate you joining us over this weekend. All right, we'll take a break for 15 minutes, and we'll restart at the bottom of the hour. Thank you. All right, we're at the bottom of the hour. I'd like to welcome everybody back from our break. Now, if we were there in person, we would have coffee and cookies, donuts, and all that kind of fun stuff. So hopefully you've had a chance to do your own little break. That is the drawback of the virtual world. But we're going to continue on with our discussant panel and roundtable. Gamal will be introducing each discussant. They'll have a few minutes to react to what they've heard. And then Gamal will bring them together in a roundtable discussion, and that will go until about 25 past the following hour. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Gamal to introduce our discussants. Gamal.
Thanks a lot, Mark, and just a quick word before we start the roundtable to thank the Iaste and its open the agenda towards the response to the COVID-19 and the pandemic in a changing world. And I wish to actually thank them for working with us, for actually allowing us to contribute to such a fantastic event. And as you know, with our Nottingham Trent University and the Center are very keen on responding to such questions about the future of tradition and heritage. All right, I think this is perhaps the most engaging part of the event today, and following a fantastic talks by our distinguished speakers. And I wish to thank them for the work that has been invested in this for several months now. Also, I wish to thank our three discussants who have been informed of the talks, and they are now going to contribute by commenting on the talks and raising a few questions. Before starting with the first one, I would like to just a brief order of the panel. Then we will start with 5 minutes to commentary by each of the three discussants. And during that their talks may raise few questions to the speakers, to our distinguished speakers, and then we'll give the speakers a chance to respond. In the meantime, we have been collating questions from the attendees and the audience of our session in the first part of the session, and we have plenty of questions to ask. So following the first communication or commentary of the discussants and the response by the speaker, then we will raise the questions received from the floor. It's a pleasure to start with the first discussant, Professor Nizar Sayad. Professor Nizar Sayad is Iaste founder and Professor Emeritus of Architecture, City Planning and Urban Design and Urban History at UC Berkeley. He was a faculty director of the Center for Arab Society and Environment, CASES, and for 2 decades, he also chaired the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Berkeley. Educated as an architect and a planner at MIT and UC Berkeley, Dr. Sayad is principally an urbanist whose speciality is the study of cities, their urban spaces, their social practices, and their economic realities. As a scholar, Sayad has authored and edited more than 20 books on colonialism, identity, Islamic architecture, tourism, traditions, urban history, and urban formality, and the list goes on. Professor Sayad is well known to the Iaste community, and his biography is quite long, so I would stop there, and I would like to invite him to offer his discussion, reflections, and commentary on the talks today. Nizar, it's a pleasure to introduce you, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I would very much like to thank all our speakers today. It has been a pleasure to hear all of you in this somewhat unusual format that we're not really used to. Iaste has always been a community of scholars that meets every 2 years, and friendships have actually evolved over the 30-some years of the history of the association. I'm going to start by just positing a number of questions to each of you, but at the same time, I think that there are questions that can be answered possibly by any one of you. Starting with Neil, I very much appreciated your characterization of how globalization has sort of accelerated certain forms of people and nations' behaviors, in terms of sort of the appeal of heritage as a venue for income generation, the spread of nationalism, which has encouraged the rise of patriotic monuments, so on and so forth. And then you make this very interesting statement that the result has been this very strange hybrid of preserved traditions that are neither resilient nor truly preservative. And the question that comes to mind here is do you think that the pandemic will, in a sense, moderate or even have an impact on these effects of globalization in the direction that preservation, if you will take? You also suggest that the modern idea of tradition is almost an externally imposed ideological trope that defines its representation as pure, more admirable, and almost always good. And again, end quote. This was a statement you made in the written document that I got. And it's a beautiful statement. You wouldn't necessarily get any argument, I think, from any of the Iaste members about it. However, in the sort of the longer tradition of Iaste scholarship, we have always viewed tradition not simply as the static legacy of the past, but rather as a dynamic project that sort of redefines the past almost for the purposes of the present. So it's ideologically laden, and in a sense we view it to a great extent also as very contingent, as very transient, as very ephemeral. So for me, then the question becomes, what kind of preservation can we pursue if we work with that definition? A definition that is somewhat flexible, but it's a definition that in a sense removes nostalgia, which is a very fundamental component in how you define a tradition, or actually not how you define tradition, but rather how nations define it and how nations then pursue it. In terms of what Sarah posited, and I thank you very much for your very thoughtful presentation. Of course, I love the example of the British Museum and what it did with the removal of Hans Sloane's statue. And I like the fact that you also connected this very much so, if you will, to to what was going on in the United States, particularly with the Black Lives Matter movement and what's going on with the removal of the statues of the Confederacy. For me, one of the issues, which I think is sort of the elephant in the room, is where does this stop? When is it legitimate to sort of allow all cultures to speak for themselves? And I think this is also a question that Michael can certainly contribute to. So if we accept the narrative, which I don't, that the pyramids, for example, were built by slaves, and slaves created much of the culture of ancient Egypt, why do we continue to celebrate the pyramid and not demolish them? And if we decide not to demolish them, then why would they stay as sort of a symbol of an extremely important historic culture? Of course, again, this is a rhetorical question more than anything else. But I think in light of the current tension that exists in the world today, this is a fundamental issue that I think needs to be resolved. Ironically, by politicians, both at the national and at the local level, and not necessarily, and by legislators as well. So for me, that's something I'd like to raise with you. And of course, in the end, you also raise this very interesting issue about that your interest in computational mythology is not based on database logic, but almost rather on what you consider a data set to be manipulated by one in which computation then becomes experiential, spatial, and materialized, embedded and embodied through various participatory, interactive, and immersive regimes. So here, for me, is there a danger of fakery in this exercise? Would you accept that this openness also provides for a term that has become acceptable in the United States today, alternative truth, which has sort of come out of the Trump administration, along the lines almost of fake news? For Julia, I don't really have a question. I have more of a comment, and I actually fully agree that climate change is absolutely the most disruptive today of our traditions. But the impact of climate change on sort of modern environments has been much more severe than their impact on the vernacular. And I think you partly pointed to that a bit. However, in some of the latest research that people who study the vernacular have actually done just in the past few months, it has become very clear today that the vernacular is not really as sustainable as we always assumed it to be, because it has become very difficult to draw the line between the modern and the vernacular in many settings. So in a sense, my comment is, what is it that can be really learned from vernacular architecture today? And are we not really talking about the vernacular, but rather are we talking about isolated communities? Because it seems that it's in isolated communities that they have managed to, if you will, survive the impact of the pandemic. Their being away from others is what allowed for their survival. Finally, to Michael, and I have to say, I again very much appreciate not only your talk, but your TV presentations. which are very rich. Obviously, you are a historian that has the capacity to take very difficult matters and share it with a public audience. My main issue here is assuming that COVID-19 will never go away. And there's a lot of talk about that today. Will the pandemic in this regard then change how we do field work in history? Will it change our methods? In the end, you also posit a very nice duality suggesting that we should move history from subjects understood as facts towards history that is basically based on the experiences of different periods and of different places. My question here is then, how will we understand the traditions of different groups of people who may inhabit the same place but have fundamentally different subcultures and experiences? And I think the experience of the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States is a very good proof of that. In other words, who will the new history speak for? Are the new subjects and objects of history conversion in this case? I think I will stop for now and sort of allow my other discussants or the speakers to come in.
Thanks a lot, Nizar, and a few questions for our speakers that hopefully that they have taken note of, and then we'll respond to them following the other discussant.
Yes.
Then we'll move to the second discussant, Jeffrey Cody. And Jeff Cody has been at the Getty Conservation Institute since 2004, focusing primarily on conservation training activities in Southeast Asia. From 1995 to 2004, he taught architecture history at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. He is the author of Building in China, Henry Murphy's Adaptive Architecture, and Exploring American Architecture, 1870 to 2000. He also co-edited Chinese Architecture and the Poo Art and the Brush and Shutter Early Photography in China. He holds a PhD in Architecture History from Cornell University. Jeff, thank you very much for being with us today. Please, the floor for you, and hopefully to make it limited to 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This has been a very inspiring series of talks and comments, and what I'm about to do is maybe add further complications, because I have a few questions that that these talks, these very stimulating talks, have inspired in me. So I'm just going to, in the interest of time, I'm going to just do a little bit of what Nizar did of taking these in sequence. Although I found it very interesting that one of the main questions that I'm about to ask Neil Silberman was really bookended in a way by Michael's talk about history. So let me just begin with Neil. I found it very fascinating, this distinction that you made between the reality of heritage on the part of national governments, what in the jargon of my field is sometimes called states parties, national government's interpretation of heritage versus local interpretations. And it made me think a great deal of some of the work of Michael Hertzfeld and the work that he's done in Bangkok in particular, something that Montira can well relate to, having to do with the ways that in times that local people try to rise up in rebellion against what some people have called the authorized heritage discourse of outstanding universal values and the infrastructure of global heritage, when these local communities, like the community of Pom Mahakan in Bangkok, try to rise up, very often they are pushed out of the way by the power of these larger institutions. And I'm just kind of curious how to overcome that reality. It's an enormous question, but I was thinking a great deal about that during Neil's remarks. I also came to a question about how to overcome the reality of these neoliberal fiscal operations worldwide that have led so much to gentrification on a global scale, and how is it that we people in the sector of arts and culture and humanities can push back against that in realistic terms when the power structure is so strongly against that. I was very interested in this question of the protest movement and the Reformation brewing that seems to be so manifest from the Black Lives Matter movement globally and coming out of the pandemic. And I guess I'm wondering, what are the implications of that? What do you see as the implications of that? If we push that 10 to 20 years forward, do you imagine that it's going to result in the elimination of the World Heritage System, for example? I'm just curious how you would interpret that. And finally, the key question that you come to, which I think is the one that leads me really to Michael Scott's talk, is about how do we reimagine the past? And I thought that was a very fundamental question, which I thought that Michael, in a way, was taking up with his talk. So I'm just going to move quickly to Michael's talk, because that, it seemed to me, gave us some interesting examples of how we might reimagine this past, both in terms of virtual technologies, digital technologies, history as experience, the blended learning that he talked about. I'm just kind of curious, and this is a question now for Michael, how you see, I mean, one of the things you didn't mention that I think is important to underscore is the way that the historical discipline has changed so much in this last generation to now to the point where we have global history as a major subfield of history, and the way that how do you see this development of global history, so to speak, leading us to a better understanding of the myriad untold histories that we don't often get to hear about. I had a great deal of thought as you talked and as you, in looking at your notes beforehand, about the work of Amitav Ghosh, for example, in India, and the way that he makes these connections and reminds us of these myriad connections throughout history. You alluded to some of them in your brief talk, that we know so little about. And so it seems to me this is a potential for inspiring new discoveries in history. I just very quickly, time's up. Okay, I just want to very quickly ask Julia to think about how to push further this notion of the renewal of cities, and particularly in the global South, where some inspiring examples might be. And in terms of Sarah, I was wondering if you might have something to say about the recent ICOM controversy, about the resignation of the ICOM director and the insurrection that seems to be happening within the museum world about what is a museum as we come out of this greater world that we're in now. Thank you very much. Sorry for going a bit over.
Not a lot at all. Thanks a lot, Jeff. Really important point. It's just, I'm sorry for the shortage of time and limitations that we have. All right, moving to the third discussant, Montira Harangora Onakul. Montira is Iaste's current vice president and a national professional officer at the UNESCO Thailand. She has a BA in economics and East Asian studies from Harvard University and master's degree in architecture and planning from the University of California at Berkeley. She has a PhD in planning from Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok, Thailand. Since 2001, she has had an active role in implementing UNESCO program in the Asia Pacific region related to the safeguarding and sustainable development of cultural heritage, which focus on the World Heritage site. Thanks a lot, Montira, for being with us. Please, your comments, and please keep it to 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and thanks to all the speakers for your thought-provoking interventions today. I mean, I think clearly from the speeches today, but also from many sessions that have been convened on this topic in the last few months, I mean, it's clear that the COVID pandemic has precipitated a crisis which has revealed the underlying workings of other crises that are facing us. So climate change, and then now with Black Lives Matter and many other protests around the world, sort of the underlying currents of social injustice, which have just been magnified by the current pandemic. So it's just revealing kind of structural issues that were there already. And I'd like to attempt to look at the various talks today in terms of a response to that. First, we have, and I think many people are familiar with the whole shtick about the known knowns, the unknown unknowns, and then the known unknowns, no? And I'm going to attempt to do this in a bit of a reductive matter with new and old, no? So on the one hand, in one quadrant, we have the old olds, right? This is the tradition of tradition that Neil Silberman kind of criticizes or calls to question. You know, for all the various reasons that he raised, gentrification, you know, kind of suppression of marginalized communities and so forth. And I think there's clearly a great, you know, lashback against this so-called tradition of tradition. And yet at the same time, Michael Scott, you know, in this moment of pandemic, shows how so many different institutions are trying to continue to give us access to these traditions, or to allow us to recreate these traditions, or allow us to engage with these traditions. And in a way, it shows that the appetite for the old is still there, and we're using new ways to engage the old, but that, you know, people still have, is it nostalgia or you know an appreciation of history or whatever. There's still a desire to sort of to get at that, right? And then another response is to completely kind of protest against the established order. And this is what we're seeing with Black Lives Matter, and we're seeing even in, you know, sort of the uber conservative bastions of heritage institutions like ICOMOS and so forth, you know, a new discussion about, well, what about the heritage of the marginalized? But as Neil brings up, and also a few of the other speakers bring up, for instance, Sarah, in fact, the ways that the so-called marginalized are representing their own heritage is precisely by co-opting the very traditional forms and language and, you know, processes of established heritage orders. And so it's sort of, it's a new take, but using an old vocabulary and using old mechanisms. And so it's two different ways of the new engaging with the old, which at the end of the day, that sort of underlying backbone of heritage order is still there, right? Even though it's being completely subverted, but you know, some of that logic is still really immutable. And then we have Sarah Kennardine suggesting that, well, forget about the old, you know, I mean, there's so many new ways to do new things. And so this is the sort of Schumpeter model of creative destruction. And so we have, you know, let's not even try to represent the old necessarily, you know, or why don't we just break out of the mold entirely and then engage in completely new formats, completely new content, you know, completely new platforms, and, you know, what will come out of this brave new world, as it were. And Julia Barfield picks up a little bit on some of these same issues, I think, in terms of response from the design and the architecture world, where there are things that are coming out that are entirely new. But it's interesting that she also, you know, takes us back full circle to where Neil started in terms of the old, by saying that one of the responses that is coming out of this crisis, and particularly bearing in mind kind of the realization that we are at the threshold of the upper limit of what the Anthropocene can bear, right? We are at a perfect point of crisis from a social point of view, from an environmental point of view, where neither the planet nor society can take very much more. And one of her responses is, well, maybe we find solace, or maybe we find a way out in the old. And that's the role of vernacular architecture. That's the role of traditional building systems, an understanding of living with, the ecology and the social kind of fabric which has formed us through centuries and generations, and in fact may be one way out. Although Nizar questions whether it really is, such a perfect way out as such. And so I'm actually at my point. Please. So I think through this conversation that we've had, we're seeing, all these different responses and possibilities for how the new and the old, sort of as a kind of reductive shorthand for these experiences, can take us into the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Mentira. And as we have heard from the discussants, there's a lot of interesting points and many questions. So now, by inviting, before we go to the open session for open questions of the audience, may I ask the speaker to address some of these points briefly in 5 minutes, and it doesn't have to be precise to a direct response to each point, but perhaps you can really reflect on the points raised and response from your perspective rather than point by point answers. So may I start with Neil? Please, if you Neil, reflect on these comments and then try to keep it within 5 minutes, please.
Unmute. So many questions, so little time. Okay, I'm going to deal with Mentira's question about the old. And I think that we've got to, first of all, start by dividing heritage. And that includes academic history. It includes archaeological historiography, every kind of expression or representation of the past from the past. And I want to deal with this issue of tradition. And I certainly agree with Nizar's idea, summing up of Iaste scholarship, that it is ephemeral. There's no question about that. Because the old is not that old. What we have as a mechanism for interpreting the past really is at most, let's say, 150 years old. Before that, there were very different ways. And what I want to say is that tradition is not only ephemeral, but it's got a valence. When I said that it's usually good, I meant it's like usually considered, whether all of our authorized heritage discourses are sites of conscience or national commemoration, it's always seen as a sort of cultural vitamin that people are better off absorbing in some way. Now, the problem of the local and the national is a very serious one, because AHD, that authorized heritage discourse, in my mind, is a poison pill. Because when resisting groups begin to imitate the authorized heritage discourse with a different story, it is the framework and the structure that in turn excludes people within the resisting group. There is basically, it's always been said that history is written by the winners, but I would say that heritage and tradition is managed by the powerful. And my whole approach to this is not merely to give everyone a World Heritage Site, but rather adopt the Amartya Sen kind of idea about capabilities. Because reflecting on the past is something that every community, every family, every individual does automatically. And it is rather encouraging the ability of people to understand the traditions within which they live and which are good for them, rather than learning, let's say, some master narrative however cleverly or ingeniously presented, that the future is going to lie. So I see with COVID an acceleration of the heritage industry being for fewer and fewer people with the money and time to jet off to Angkor Wat or to visit heritage sites, while other communities in the global south and in the global north who aren't going to have the opportunity to visit sites, or even in some case visit them virtually, are going to have to use tradition as a tool for survival. And there's so much more to say about this, but I would just say that my critique is based on the idea of the concentration of power in certain representations of tradition in the past. I hope that's enough.
Thanks a lot, Neil. Really appreciate it. All right, moving to Sarah. Please, Sarah, if you provide your commentary and reflections on the answers or points raised.
Sure. I might start backwards also with Montira's comment about making everything new. And it always reminds me when I hear this discourse, it's not about the destruction of the past. It's much more a Homi Bhabha idea of insurgent acts of cultural translation, where the past and the present become part of a in-between space of innovation. And it's not about I work a lot in World Heritage sites and on big archives and on objects. And actually for me, it's about finding these new modes or augmented ways of access as opposed to their entire destruction. I think where artists come in, especially in the use of new technologies, is the way in which they can be very prescient. They can articulate for us a future that we cannot see. And also that they are able to reconfigure and distort, if you like, or create these in-between spaces. So I think it's not so much about the denial of the past, but its reuse. That's certainly something. And for me, and when I think of Nazar, you mentioned these issues of aura, authenticity, the object, the way that these are dealt with in the digital realm. And this is a constant criticism since we first started making virtual objects. We've done quite a lot of studies that study the juxtaposition of the real and the virtual object. Bruno Latour talks about now the migration of aura from the real object to the digital object, whereas I prefer to talk about this proliferation of auras, where these digital experiences, if you like, have profound auratic effect in their own right. They can sit in powerful relationships with real objects or real sites. Their biography, of course, is enabled by these originating works. But that's is certainly something that we've written a lot about in the past. Interestingly, I'm going to have a new exhibition next year in March called Deep Fakes, New Materialities and the Experience of Art. And this is all about that challenge of aura and authenticity, authorship, super high-end digital technologies, artificial intelligence, and cultural heritage. So should you come to Lausanne, that would be fantastic to see you there. Otherwise, I'm sure we'll broadcast some stuff. If we, also you mentioned the pyramids, iconization of certain objects versus their contextualization. And I think that move of the Sloan bust from the central galleries into a case with context is a lot to do with most of the work that we are undertaking. counter-narratives are also very important. Currently, I'm just finishing a big project across 12 countries, which is the Atlas of Maritime Buddhism. It's the spread of Buddhism from India to China and down to Korea and Japan as a kind of counterbalance to the untold story of the Maritime Silk Road and the Chinese government One Belt, One Road initiative, which seeks to, in a way, rewrite a certain amount of this early history. So these counter-narratives are also very important, very complex. I think the work that Michael is doing is also in this area of complex narrative. Icon definitions, you can tell me when my time is up. The digital had to do, I think, with challenging the authority of the museum, which led to ideas of distribution, ideas of participatory engagement, of inclusiveness. The digital divide also threw up that inclusiveness debate. So the new ICOM or proposed ICOM definition was really much in the vein of the voice of the visitor. And the voice of the visitor, I think, is exemplified or rather re-emphasized post-COVID, because cultural organizations have suddenly realized without those visitors, they have very little rationale for existence, certainly in the form they're in now. They could become distributed archives, but their complexes are very much challenged when they have no visitors. So I think we're re-entering this moment where the visitor takes central importance to the definition of museums. And that's, I think, partly where that redefinition of ICOM came from. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Sarah. I know that lots of time is needed to reflect on all points, but we'll move to the next speaker. Julia, if you please come in and then reflect on the points raised and the question asked.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I'd be very interested in hearing about the recent vernacular studies that Nezar talked about. I'd be very interested to hear more about that, particularly the recent ones. I mean, my reflection on vernacular architecture was very much, was not kind of literal really, but it's just in the way that they took materials that were local to them, and they were very, very frugal in their use. And I think that's where we can learn lessons. It's nothing to do with style or cultural forms or anything like that. It's just in an attitude to the quantum of materials that we use, which have clearly got to get less, and a kind of attitude to simplicity, I suppose, also, and a kind of universality. And you know, in this kind of age of the climate emergency, we do need to consider whether, you know, how much we build, and maybe we shouldn't be building as much as we are. I mean, I think we do need to ask ourselves those kind of fundamental questions. And in terms of how Jeff asked about the pushing forward renewable cities in the global south, well, you know, I think there's many cities in the global south that are doing similar things to other parts of the world. In fact, Bogota, I know, has actually had car-free Sundays since the 1970s. So, you know, I think we can learn a lot from that, and it's doing similar things to many other cities around the world in actually reducing the for instance, the use of cars. But I mean, I think a lot of cities in the global south, because they were so unplanned, don't have a lot of public space. So that's an area where I think that there could be more discussion in the future about how we respond to that. But I just wanted to make a general point about cultural tourism, and because I think what we've seen is that you know, cultural tourism was becoming a real problem to many cities. You know, Barcelona, Venice, you know, a lot of the cities where they were overwhelmed by it. And And you know, in the context of the climate emergency, we actually can't be, you know, taking an aeroplane to Venice for a weekend. You know, we've got to stop. It's just not. It's not viable. You know, and so I think there needs to be, you know, and I think that's where invisible cities are so is so interesting, because they create a whole virtual world that that actually shows us almost more than we would see if we went there. So I don't know if there's any clues there, you know, I would just have a, you know, if I may kind of go into areas which are not really mine, but the whole Soane bust being moved, it was, to my mind, it was just taking it off the pedestal. It wasn't that we don't you know, recognise the good works that he did, and the contribution that he made to the British Museum, but the fact that he was on the pedestal just shows that there's, you know, that he is venerated in a way that maybe, you know, now we question, and that he, it's not kind of destroying it; it's just setting it in the right contemporary context. I think that's
time. Yes, it's about time. Thanks a lot, Julia. All right, Michael, it's over to you. Michael Scott, please, to comment and reflect on the points made.
Thank you very much. And again, apologies for my voice. It's not COVID, it's the common cold that has affected me at the present time. Hopefully it will survive. I wanted to sort of lead this with Nazar's formulation to me of who will new history kind of speak for, and if I can add to that, who will new history be for? And to respond to just in a couple of different ways to that. I was really excited when Julia was talking about vernacular architecture and the use and reuse of stuff that comes from a place. And my hope very much is that architectural design and construction thinks increasingly more about its place, that new buildings should be rooted in their place and in their history. And I think we now have the technologies to be able to have that history more seamlessly interwoven into structures as they're built. And I think that will allow people to choose the histories that they want to talk about, focus on, and put up front and center in their individual environments. And that will allow for much more multiple histories to be on physical display within our landscapes, which I think is one great way of responding to the idea of who will history speak for and be for. I'm thinking particularly a building in London of the recent Bloomberg building with its Mithraeum that was uncovered and excavated in the basement and has now become a permanently accessible public feature of the building. But you know, we don't all have a Mithraeum underneath us, so I think there's lots of ways in which we can do this. Secondly, thinking about this point as history as experience that I wanted to put forward, that we are encouraging, and I would encourage any person I kind of who wants to get into history to think about history as experience. And I think we can do that through the technologies that are now available to us, virtual reality, but also bringing in the insights, for instance, of cognitive science. One of the areas I'm involved in at the moment is to think about ancient religious experiences within sanctuary sites using the insights of modern cognitive science, given that the brain hasn't really changed that much in 2,000 years. And again, hopefully that can give us those multiple viewpoints of what history, who history is speaking for and for. And that, I think, will allow us to counteract, as Neil was putting forward, this rather a difficult and sort of over demanding sense of tradition that he spoke of. And it just reminded me of this example of ancient Sparta in the Roman era. Romans came to Sparta wanting only one thing from Sparta: to see hard military might on display. And so the Spartans, who were rather down on their luck at the time and rather impoverished and not really doing very well, had no option but to play up to this Roman desired traditional image of Sparta, and so started creating ancient festivals for Roman tourists to take part in, which had never actually occurred at any point in Sparta's history. So we see this invention of tradition to live up to traditional expectations dating back to antiquity. Very briefly to think about, and this was at the point Jeff was making, the importance of history of global connectivity and bringing this onto every historical curricula and test paper going forward across the globe. It's very interesting, I think, that the OECD, which runs the PISA program, the Program for International Student Assessment, in 2018, in terms of looking at the key things that curricula around the world should be teaching our students. In 2018, alongside literacy and numeracy, they added the new criteria of global competency. And that wasn't meaning, can they speak multiple languages? It was meaning, can these students, are we teaching these students how to engage and appreciate people coming from different cultural backgrounds with different cultural views and ideas, and views indeed of history, as well as many other things. And I think here, not only should we be exploring histories of global connectivity, but we can really take advantage of the modern technologies to be able to teach and learn in global ways. Why can students not be learning about these issues simultaneously with students from different parts of the world? And finally to the data, and I loved Sarah's hope for the future that all data could be fitted into one suitcase with her new techniques and technologies. And this would be a plea from me, because until we have the data from our past, all of it that we have, available publicly, equally accessibly, without having to travel around the world to multiple libraries, we're not going to be able to offer those multiple viewpoints that I think are going to be so important going forward. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Michael. And now we have run a little bit over time, and one of the interesting new realities that we are facing now is that we are booked for airtime. So when we try to extend the session, they give us only 5 minutes. Other than that, because there is some tech giant executive or a staff somewhere is controlling how we communicate here. So I would like to mention that we have received plenty of questions, and we had to summarize them. And unfortunately, we don't have the names, so we will have to be very selective. And I will raise question to each speaker first, and once we get brief answer, we might move to another cycle if the time allows. So my apologies for not taking all questions on board, and please be brief in your answer to no more than 2 minutes. I will alter the order a little bit. So I will start with a question to Sarah Kinderdine. And the question is, what would you say are the effects on the way we create, express, and consume cultural experiences in the context of the unequal access to digital technology and the imposed curation through mass-produced, generically designed digital technologies? So the question about unequal access to digital technologies and whether this is just really putting people out of the cultural scene. Sarah?
I mean, absolutely. These are really big issues. In other less technically advanced societies, different modes of technology are coming to the fore that are a lot more inexpensive. The mobile phone technology is huge in various parts of the world, and the primary mode of access to all sorts of culture. I think the question is also dovetailed with what I think is a kind of cultural imperialism of our times. And this is where the big tech companies are able to hoover up large sections of our cultural heritage and represent it through their hegemonic kind of interfaces, usually with very banal commentary, lacking the kind of sophistication, storing vast quantities of data in inaccessible silos to be then resold to the community. I call it the mining of patrimonial capital. So finding these new points of access for different communities is one of the fundamental purposes of a lot of the scientific research that's going on. While many are dealing with the high end, others are dealing with how we can create fantastic battery life for small devices, how we recycle things, how indeed we store digital data and synthetic DNA. So it's a combination of both the advancement of science to solve some of these challenges, and then of course, we could go to the capitalization of the world through technology and big tech companies, which is largely creating these inequalities.
Thanks, Sarah. Definitely a big question that requires lots of extended answer, but appreciate the time. Next question is for Julia. And there are a number of questions in general, but they are all more or less connected. And it's about the treatment to architects being always late to respond, or maybe a cause of problems when it comes to climate emergency. So the question
I didn't hear that question.
Gamal, yeah, can you please repeat, Gamal?
All right, Julia, it's a comment on my reflection that architects are normally accused of being late in responding to climate emergency. And the question is reflecting on your presentation, saying that your presentation illustrates that clients were the largest impediment for the construction industry moving forward in regard to climate change. It seems that raising awareness and educating clients seem to be still one of the most important aspects of architecture practice. Can you please comment on this?
Well, I think that is all of that is true to a degree. I think there are many architects like ourselves who've been trying to do sustainable architecture for many years, but all of a sudden, with the urgency that is clear now, that I think it's not just architects, but I think the world has been kind of sleepwalking into this kind of emergency for 30 years now. But when it became clear, the urgency is that all of this sustainable architecture that we've been trying to do is just not enough. We need to make much more radical changes than we had before. And yes, I think there are some clients that are going to need to be sort of educated, I suppose, in a way. But actually, I'm kind of hopeful that it's actually coming from bottom up and top down. So, the Bank of England now, I think, as a result of Mark Carney in particular, they're now requiring all financing to be monitored for its sustainability and its kind of effect on the net zero. So, I actually think that it's not happening fast enough, but and that's why this group of architects got together in order to try and push it harder. But there are signs of hope as well coming from not just other architects and engineers in particular, but also from some clients. But there's still a long, long way to go, I have to say, sadly.
Right, thanks, Julia. Next question to Michael. And Michael, reflecting on your practice and using technology to analyze historic buildings, and considering that many pandemics have occurred through history, then how research on that you have developed and the techniques that you have used on traditional settlements and architecture about housing could promote wellness or can flexibly respond to recurring health crises for a longer periods of time? Could we learn from your work?
Well, I definitely don't think we should learn anything from the ancients in terms of their approach to health, given that they were all very happy to jump into the same public baths in the Roman world, even if they had sort of weeping sores and other sorts of ailments. The one thing we get from antiquity, and this has been mentioned already, is that those environments in which there was simply more physical space between individual housing units did better, and plagues tended to come through when everyone was crushed in together. So I think that primacy on space and people wanting more space and the sort of movement of where people want to live henceforth is something I think we're going to see happening quite strongly. I was just also struck, if I may, by a question that came up about whether place and place making will become more important as a result of the pandemic. And it struck me that actually for a good part of what I might call the younger generation, COVID-19 lockdown was the first time in their lives that they had the experience that they could not leave their local place. They could not go elsewhere, and they actually had to be rooted to their place. And so I think actually place making as a result is going to be a much, much more important part of people's lives as people have now experienced it for the first time.
Thanks a lot, Michael. Question to Neil, and it's about the nature of the disruptive nature of COVID-19. And the question is, what has been framed as disruptive to COVID-19? Something the cultural heritage sector has eagerly prevented for a long time. If the system that rules cultural heritage has shown difficulties in incorporating change, how feasible will it be to link cultural heritage to current topics that's critical, like food security, CO2, or free access to heritage, when the system promotes the opposite?
Neil, you are muted.
You are muted, Neil.
Can't waste any time at all with this. Okay, that's all afternoon we can be talking about this, but let me just focus on a couple of the issues that have been brought up. Julia rightfully mentioned the impossibility of continuing with cultural tourism as it was in the before time constituted, and that's certainly true. But I think that we also have to consider how dependent economies have become on cultural tourism. I just finished a project in the Caribbean which is completely dependent on cultural tourism. And when it stops, it's not easy to find a substitute. I just want to mention again about the digital and the virtual and so forth, and return to this idea of the monopoly of power. Because the problem of local museums, the problem of all kinds of museums, is, to put it crudely, how to monetize, how to replace the economic system of the museum with the virtual. And unfortunately, we're living in a world where, whether it is smartphones or whether it is desktop applications, that the money and the power is very much concentrated. I'll just end with the fascinating suggestion by Michael about the use of cognitive science. This is definitely perhaps the most productive place to go, but I would suggest that in addition to trying to recreate past experiences, we apply cognitive scientific research on what the meaning of tradition is today. How can we use tradition, and what does it mean for people to address those pressing problems of survival, food security, global climate change in the world today?
Thanks a lot, Neil. There are a few questions that really correspond to the four speakers and talks and even discussions commentary, but I will use here as a kind of spontaneous structure. So I will start with Sarah and its connection again to the use of information technology in cultural practice. So the use of cultural practices as a means of rebellion, has a long history, knowledge of which appears to have increased in the information age. Until now, this appears to have been largely overlooked by the heritage sector. Do you think this is something that heritage sector should engage with in the coming years?
Absolutely. I have been critical for some time about the silos created within something like UNESCO, which removes intangible cultural heritage from the built environment and from the memory of the world, as they call it, the documentary heritage. This ability to bring these data sets together and to start to think about new data frameworks entirely, ones that deal with embodied knowledge systems, ones that deal with variable ontologies of description. These are what we need to start to respond in the heritage sector to what this respondent is asking, I think.
Thanks. Michael, may I bring you on this topic because it's related, of course, to your work and the way that you start to engage technology in understanding and analyzing heritage. Can you reflect on this point and how far we have really come a long way from dealing with heritage in a non-technological way?
Yes, I mean, I think it would be kind of only to all our advantages if we think about a much more joined up approach. I too share Sarah's issues with the way things are compartmentalized, because while that is done for understandable purposes of making things feasible to do and to comprehend and to fit into systems, they often then end up not reflecting reality. I remember very vividly, you alluded to the book on global history that I wrote in 2016. And I remember vividly being asked repeatedly by every publisher I turned to. The first question was, which shelf does it sit on in the bookstore? Because the idea was they couldn't imagine how it would be sold if it couldn't sit on a particular shelf. And of course, the answer to that by 2020 is there's now a shelf for global history. But it strikes at the very difficulty of how we organize and compartmentalize knowledge, and as a result, do a disservice to the reality of the experiences we're trying to study.
Thanks a lot, Michael. There is a question to Nizar and Julia. I think I will start with Julia and then Nizar to add to it. To what extent can we run into or make use lessons from the vernacular? How do we choose or dissect the appropriate lessons? Where do we stop? What do we learn and what do we leave? Julia and then Nizar, please.
Well, I tried to answer that in my talk. I'm not sure if I've got a huge amount to add because I'm not an academic in this field. It's just, I just had a look at, because those books that I had a picture of in my talk, they were books that I read when I was a student. Rereading them was very interesting. And one of the things that I hadn't quite realized was that the Architecture Without Architects, Bernard Brodowski, was an exhibition in the 60s that in New York in the MoMA. And it was actually created by some of the modern architects of the time. Walter Gropius and Mies van der Rohe were the people who organized it. So, I think, and they're the people that, in their architecture were very much about throwing out the history of the past and architecture of the past. And yet, I think with vernacular, it seems to somehow sidestep some of the kind of historical progression of architecture, because it is so universal and it is so of place and of culture and of touching lightly on the earth, as I said. But I'm sure Nizar has much more to say about it, seeing as he's written a whole paper, a recent paper about it, and I'm by no means an expert, so I'll pass to him.
Yeah, actually, this is a huge question, and I've not just written a paper about it, I've written an entire book. The paper that I wrote more recently, that I was referring to, which is almost 5-6 years ago now, talks about the what I call the myth of the sustainable vernacular. But I think to address the larger question, the vernacular definitely offers quite a lot of lessons to contemporary practice. And I think your invocation, particularly of Rudovsky himself was a modernist architect. And in a sense, even if we go back to someone like Corbusier, his tremendous fascination in the tour that he did throughout the Mediterranean impacted the production of his architecture, absolutely. But what is beautiful about your intervention is that you managed to point precisely to that contradiction between the appreciation of the vernacular as form and a full understanding of the vernacular as sort of social and cultural milieu that in and of itself is quite complex. And in a sense, that's the reason that I actually mentioned this notion of what COVID allowed us to understand is that it is not so much about how some materials are put together. It's not so much about the process by which people even build altogether. When I teach Radofsky, I never teach him by himself. I always have to add to him Amos Rappaport's book, House, Form, and Culture, which is, again, a very small book, but it's a beautiful book that basically tells us that many of what Radofsky assumed to be climatic responses are not climatic at all. They're actually simply a product of the constraints that existed within a very specific site. Many of the articulations that we assumed were cultural responses, again, were more about social structures within certain communities. So I think what this reminds us of is that tradition is often about constraint. It's about constraint and restraint. In a sense, it's about constraint because people have to do or make do with whatever they have. Sometimes whatever they have under their feet, whatever they have in given locations, so on and so forth. But over time, constraint becomes restraint. And it appears to me that that's where architecture could benefit tremendously from the practices of the vernacular. By this, I mean the following, that in a sense, we know examples. One of the best examples is in Santorini, in one of the Greek Isles, where local residents used to build vaults that used mainly stone. When it was discovered that you could actually do the vault with concrete, you can have a form and you can pour concrete, the vault did not disappear, even though the main reason for building it was initially structural. The form itself had acquired a very specific cultural importance and a visual importance that it continued in a sense. So it appears to me that the vernacular offers lessons in this regard, some of which may have to do with form, some of which may have to do with culture, some of which may have to do with social structures. And in a sense, that's what architects have not dealt with as much. They have more focused, if you will, on what form has to offer us. There's a lot that I can add to this, but I know that Gamal will stop me right now, so I'll stop here.
Thanks, Nizar. Thanks, Julia. Thanks, Sarah, Michael, Neil, and Montera, and Jeff. It was a fantastic roundtable, and really we wish to extend, but yeah, we have received the orders that we will be cut off air, and I'm sure Michael is very familiar with this concept as well. But really, it was fascinating. Thank you very much for the several months of preparation and coming today, and hopefully this conversation will continue between us, and we'll see you in Nottingham in April next year, hopefully face to face, and when we will have no restriction on time. Thanks a lot, everyone. Thanks for your talks. Thanks for all audience and for their questions. I will hand over now to Professor Hisham Isa, the host, and then to Mark. So back to you, Hisham and Mark.
Thank you, Gamal. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we have now reached the end of our 2.5-hour event. It was a long marathon. The first ever Iaste virtual symposium. It is my great pleasure that I have been one of the behind-the-scenes individuals who managed this discussion about the post-COVID-19 era and how it will impact our research in the arena of traditional environment. I would like very much to thank all our panelists and discussants for their remarkable talks and reflection on the pandemic and its impact on traditional built environment. The presentation were excellent, and the discussion was very fruitful in raising important issues. It is my opinion that the purpose of this symposium that we started with has been accomplished. Our original theme for the 2020 Iaste conference, Virtual Tradition, was actually chosen way before the pandemic. Perhaps it was a far-sighted act on our part of organizing committee to recognize the importance of the virtual, as much of the world realized it only after the lockdown of COVID-19 right now. As you all know, that the actual conference has been rescheduled for April 7 to 10th in 2021 in the original site, Nottingham, in United Kingdom. Iaste is always open to ideas, and I encourage you all to come up with ideas and collaboration ways for future virtual seminar, as well as hosting future Iaste conferences. But we at Iaste are very optimistic that the global health situation will be in a better shape to allow all of us to travel and attend the conference next year. This optimism is a reflection of many historical precedents of such a similarity. We made the hard decision to postpone the conference as opposed to holding it virtually because we believe that Iaste meetings are more of a family reunion that happen every 2 years, where scholars from many different parts of the world not only exchange scholarly knowledge, but also renew their friendship. Although the pandemic affected every aspect of modern life, surprisingly, the Iaste conference was still able to attract more than 120 presenters who obviously share our optimism since they registered to attend the April conference by the registration deadline, which passed last week. Finally, on behalf of Iaste Boards of Directors, I would like to thank Professor Muhammad Gamal Abdel Menem, the Iaste 2021 Local Conference Director, for his successful moderation of this symposium and the roundtable discussion. I am thankful for two important individuals who helped with this event also behind the scene, the Iaste coordinator Pamani Shatwa and the Iaste 2021 Local Conference Coordinator Dr. Diane Warren for their efforts. I would like to express also my appreciation to all the attendees from all over the world for taking time out of their busy duties to attend the seminar in unreasonable hours, ranging from very early morning for some to very late night for others. If you missed part of this symposium, a recording will be available at Iaste website later this week. Thank you so much. I now turn it to Mark for closing.
All right, two final comments. Thanks to Nazar Al-Sayed for the initial idea for this session. Much appreciated. Lots of great ideas you always have, Nazar. And a big thanks to you, Dr. Issa, for all of the work you've done. Thanks, everybody. We've gone a little long, but that's okay. We still have a great number of participants. Wish you the best of a continued Saturday wherever you are in the world. Thanks so much. The recording of this session will be on the Iaste website, iaste.org. So if you're interested, you can take a look at that in a few days. Take care, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.